Welcome everyone. My name is Samantha Alvis. I'm our Senior Advisor for Higher Education in the Center for Education at USAID. In this role, I advise our missions on activity designs that engage higher education institutions or post-secondary student populations. I also direct our thought leadership in the higher education space. And today I'm going to share with you a bit about our USAID Higher Education Program Framework and the future of our higher education programming. I'll start with a little bit of background for those who may not be familiar with the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. We are the lead U.S. government agency for international development. We work in more than 80 countries with programming in more than 100 countries. We do this across a number of different technical areas, which you can see on the screen, and we have a staff of more than 9,000 people, ranging from foreign and civil service officers, foreign service nationals, and contractors. Our work in the education sector at USAID is guided by the USAID Education Policy. The policy, released in 2018, guides all USAID education investments and is focused on improving learning outcomes for children and youth across the education continuum from pre-primary through higher education. So if you read nothing else about the education policy, take a look at page 9. It provides a really great overview of our work across the education continuum. Again, that's from pre-primary all the way through higher education. On this page, you'll see that the education policy has 4 priorities. Higher education is a critical piece of each of these priorities, from ensuring that there is access to quality education in the first priority, to the role that higher education plays in ensuring children and youth gain foundational skills, to ensuring that students leave higher education with skills that contribute to society, and finally, in priority 4, that higher education institutions have the capacity to be central actors in locally led development. In addition to the education policy priorities, the policy is guided by 6 principles. And you'll see that there's a connection between these principles and our higher education program framework, which I'll share more about in just a minute. The focus of these priorities, or these principles, is country focus and ownership, again, strengthening learning and educational outcomes, taking a systems perspective or approach, collaboration and partnership with others, making sure our decision-making is driven by data and evidence, and promoting equity and inclusion. With this background of USAID and how we work in the education sector set, I'd like to transition more specifically to USAID's work in higher education. When I joined USAID a little over 3 years ago, I knew that in order to guide the future of our work in higher education, we needed to know where we were and where we had been. So we set out to learn about USAID's investments in higher education through producing the USAID retrospective, thanks to the dedicated work of interns. You'll hear more about this from Morgan soon, and have a snapshot of our current programming with the USAID Higher Education Landscape Analysis. With that work, we found over 700 activities across every USAID technical sector working with or through higher education partners. These products really gave us the foundation to move forward with what the future of our higher education programming would look like, and started us on the journey to the higher education program framework and the higher education learning agenda. I'll dive into the higher education program framework here, and later Deborah will share more about how our learning agenda was developed and is shaping our work. As we embarked on our journey of developing the higher education learning agenda, we quickly realized that we needed to make a detour. Through our consultation-based process and in engaging our DC-based Higher Education Learning Agenda Task Team, as well as our Mission Task Team, we realized that there was not a common understanding or way to talk about our work in higher education across sectors. And so we made this detour to develop this program framework with the stakeholders engaged in the learning agenda process, both inside USAID and external stakeholders. We knew that higher education has the potential to advance development because of its broad reach across sectors, communities, and intersecting systems, but we just didn't have a way to talk about this. So this higher education program framework depicts USAID's common sector-inclusive understanding of a higher education system, the commitment to key higher education outcomes, and ways of engaging with higher education to achieve these outcomes. It spotlights the core functions of a higher education system. These are the light blue sections, that they provide quality and relevant education and training, that the education system advances knowledge and research and engages and strengthens networks and communities. Now, again, this is at the system level. So a higher ed institution itself may do 1, 2, 3, or all of these things, but the system itself needs to do all 3. And finally, that there's 3 outcomes of our USAID funded higher education programming. Developing the capacity of individuals, strengthening partnerships, and promoting higher education as a central actor in locally led development. And then those principles that we just highlighted in the education policy, you can see those reflected here again in the education program framework with a focus on equity and inclusion, evidence and data, local ownership, and sustainability. The program framework brings cohesiveness to our work in higher education across sectors, not prescriptiveness. Now that we know where we've been with our higher education programming, we have a way to frame our work, regardless of the sector. We can now be more thoughtful and purposeful about the future of our higher education programming. Our work in higher education moving forward will put the higher education system at the center, as system-level change is needed to make long-term impact. With our learning agenda, USAID, along with many partners, will advance the evidence base of what works across different contexts, and this will inform our activity design. In line with the USAID education policy, the local systems framework, and the agency's forthcoming local capacity development policy, investment should be focused on locally led development. And finally, we're seeking deeper and more equitable partnerships in the higher education space. Partnerships between US and partner country higher education institutions should provide opportunities for two-way learning, and US institutions should expect to be the guide on the side rather than the sage on the stage. Now, I know what I'm about to say might sound like a foreign language for those of you who are less familiar with working directly with USAID, and I'd be happy to answer any questions during the discussion time. You can see this future in our current higher education mechanism, Higher Education for Leadership, Innovation, and Exchange, or HELIX, as well as other companion mechanisms like Youth Power 2 and the Science, Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Annual Program Statement. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about USAID's past, present, and future work in higher education across sectors. And now I'll turn it over to Morgan to share with you more about the higher education retrospective and landscape analysis.
Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan McMaster, and I am a program assistant in the Center for Education at USAID. In this role, I support the work of our higher education portfolio, both in the center and with assistance to USAID missions. Today, I will be introducing our knowledge management platform, as well as 2 resources, the Higher Education Retrospective and the Higher Education Landscape Analysis, that set the stage for the work USAID has done in higher education. First, I want to share our Education Links website, which serves as the Center for Education's knowledge management platform. Education Links is where you can find reports, resources, announcements, and training opportunities from USAID, and will be the home for all of the resources you hear about today. The platform also offers the ability to engage with some of the work we are doing in the center through discussions and content submission. Now, I'm happy to share with you 2 of our higher education resources. As Samantha said, we in the Center for Education wanted to learn more about USAID's historical investments in higher education. The first resource I will be sharing today is the Higher Education Retrospective. The retrospective was written by myself and 2 virtual student federal service interns under the guidance of Samantha Alvis. It was designed to provide a historical perspective of the work USAID has done with and through higher education and its 60-year history, and really shows the power of higher education to achieve development outcomes not only in education, but across sectors. The retrospective covers around 6 decades of the agency's history. I say around because I was actually able to find higher education activities that predated the establishment of the agency in 1961. The content for the retrospective is divided into 4 major categories. Each decade and each region within that decade have a synopsis of trends in higher education activities from that time. This trend section is followed by activity spotlights that detail the work of the agency through examples of the work that was done in the field. In total, the retrospective contains 51 activity spotlights representing all sectors and regions of our work. Also included are participant profiles like the one shown here of Michaela Urbanova that showcase individuals who benefited from USAID activities either in the form of scholarships or attending an institution where USAID was involved in capacity building efforts. Finally, the retrospective contains a number of sections that detail special interest topics, such as research and innovation in higher ed, and the work of our colleagues, such as the American Schools and Hospitals Abroad Office, as well as the Global Development Lab. The basis of the research for the retrospective was done through a desk review of higher education activity documents available through USAID's Development Experience Clearinghouse, or DEC. The DEC houses design and evaluation documents from USAID activities, as well as reports and guidance documents from our regions and technical sectors. These historical documents provided the bulk of the content that went into the activity spotlights. I was also able to conduct participant and personnel interviews from USAID activities, as well as an analysis of congressional reporting in order to identify trends in policy and implementation. I now want to share a few key takeaways from the retrospective that set the stage, so to speak, for our current higher education work. First, the primary objectives of higher education activities evolved with the time period and context in which development assistance occurred. In early cases, USAID's involvement focused heavily on building physical spaces such as laboratories and dormitories where countries and institutions lack sufficient higher education infrastructure. Over time, institutional capacity development and scholarship programming became more popular, and in more recent decades, we saw more of a focus on both research and innovation and activities focused on student success, like career centers and soft skills development. Next, many of the higher education institutions that received capacity development support decades ago are now strong actors within their higher education system and countries more widely. Some institutions are now implementing partners in development assistance efforts, both in the higher education space as well as other sectors. The model of USAID scholarship assistance also evolved from funding degrees almost entirely at US institutions to more scholarship assistance going towards attending HEIs in a recipient's home country or region. In many cases, this allowed for more scholarships to be awarded, as well as increasing the probability of beneficiaries remaining in their country or region. As mentioned earlier, we see higher education institutions as both beneficiaries of and partners in development assistance. The model of partnerships between HEIs shifted from one-to-one partnerships or twinning to consortium-based models. Also observed was a shift to more local institutions acting as partners in delivering development assistance. And finally, the robustness of monitoring and evaluation practices increased greatly in the 1990s and 2000s. This reflected an overall shift in monitoring, evaluation, and learning practices across the agency that we were able to observe specifically in these higher education activities. One last thing I wanted to highlight are the pictures found on this slide, as well as throughout the retrospective. We set out to present the story of higher education at USAID, and what story is complete without pictures? While working on the retrospective, we were able to take a trip to the National Archives, where we unearthed some of the agency's hidden gems. I really encourage you to go and read the retrospective, not only for the history, but also to be able to look through some of these great photos. Okay. Now that we know more about USAID's historical investments in higher education, I'll transition to looking more at the work USAID has done recently, engaging the higher education community. So the second resource I have for you today is the Higher Education Landscape Analysis. The landscape analysis was conducted by 3 consultants led by Samantha Alvis and presents a comprehensive review of USAID's work engaging higher education across sectors and regions during fiscal years 2014 to 2018. The analysis in this report drew from document reviews of USAID activities, as well as over 20 key informant interviews from USAID and the implementing partner community. On this slide, I have listed the objectives for the landscape analysis, but today I will focus primarily on objectives 1 and 4, as many of the assessed lessons learned and gaps in the analysis identified are included in the recommendations for future programming. So what does higher education engagement currently look like at USAID? The landscape analysis identified 5 primary types of higher education engagement throughout the agency: partnerships, scholarships, institutional capacity building, workforce development, and policy reform, as shown on this slide. In most cases, these activities were not done in isolation, but in a combination with at least one other engagement type. Second, each type of engagement was found in nearly all functional and regional bureaus at USAID. The regional bureaus represent the geographic reach of USAID's involvement, and the functional bureaus representing the sectors in which we work, including health, economic growth, agriculture, democracy and governance, and so on. In this respect, higher education was really a Swiss Army knife, demonstrating the ability to achieve development objectives across the spectrum of the agency's work. Third, higher education institutions were identified as acting in 3 ways: as recipients of aid, implementers of activities, or as partners in activities. US as well as partner country higher education institutions provided higher education assistance and technical assistance both to other HEIs as well as civil society organizations, government institutions, and private businesses. Finally, the purpose of higher education engagement also varied between operating units. In many cases, USAID activities that engaged higher education did so with final objectives other than strengthening the education sector, really utilizing the cross-disciplinary expertise of those institutions. So from the landscape analysis, the researchers also presented 5 recommendations for future education programming, many of which the higher education team has already begun to address in our work. This first recommendation points towards creating a better understanding of institutional capacity development, including what works in the process of developing capacity and how institutional capacity development practices can be coordinated across the agencies and our sectors. Second, one of the major goals of USAID support in the higher education space is to make sure that when students graduate, they have received employment relevant education. This means continued engagement with the private sector and attention to workforce readiness and curriculum and student support services. Next, as these reports have shown, there is no one home for higher education at the agency. In order to ensure that activities are consistent with best practices and various policies and visions across the agency, it's important that USAID staff have the ability to communicate and share experiences. To this recommendation, the Higher Education Working Group has become a forum for over 100 USAID staff to share across sectors, while also bringing in the valuable perspective of our implementing partners and other donors. This fourth recommendation was to create mechanisms for collecting and utilizing data. The Higher Education for Learning, Innovation, and Exchange annual program statement is one such mechanism under which awards have already been made that focus on building our evidence base across the education spectrum. And then this final recommendation was to generate, collect, and disseminate evidence relevant to our work in higher education. The Higher Education Learning Agenda, which you will hear about next, is the main vehicle for which we are addressing this recommendation and will produce, organize, and promote the use of evidence to the USAID higher education community. There's so much more I could have shared with you today, but I encourage you to visit our Education Links website to read both of these resources and learn more about USAID is doing in higher ed and more broadly with its work in education. I will now hand it off to my colleague Deborah for her presentation.
Hello, my name is Deborah Greben, and I am a Senior Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Advisor with the USAID Center for Education in Washington, D.C. I support evidence and learning with a focus on use and knowledge management, and also support the agency's higher education work by providing technical input and guidance on higher education measurement, evaluations, and learning. Today, I'll be talking to you about the USAID Higher Education Learning Agenda. So for those of you unfamiliar with learning agendas, they are sets of questions that address critical knowledge gaps. And the USAID Higher Education Learning Agenda is an agency-wide learning agenda that cuts across technical areas and operating units to address questions of importance to higher education programming broadly. The learning agenda comprises a collection of 10 prioritized learning questions across 5 themes. And it was developed by USAID staff and external higher education stakeholders across technical sectors through a process that was led by USAID's Center for Education. The learning agenda guides the generation, synthesis, and dissemination of evidence to inform higher education programming, strategic planning, learning, activity design, and professional development. Its implementation and use are expected to result in better programming decisions and improved outcomes. Our goal in developing and implementing this learning agenda is to activate what we call the data and evidence ecosystem, or in other words, to influence the practice of a wide range of evidence stakeholders, whether they are generators of evidence, knowledge, or translators or users. While it's not possible for us to directly engage with all of the evidence generators, translators, and users shown here, the intention of implementation is to engage as many stakeholders as we can, and especially to engage key stakeholders who can influence broader change within the system. This slide offers a brief overview of our efforts to date to develop and finalize the learning agenda. Development was a collaborative effort that lasted over a year, beginning in 2019 and culminating in 2020. We more or less followed the roadmap graphic here, albeit in a slightly different order and with a detour early on to develop the higher education program framework. The Center for Education shepherded a process of broad stakeholder engagement that began with a stakeholder analysis and multiple stakeholder workshops that allowed for the generation and refining of themes, drafting of questions, and prioritization and selection of questions. Once questions were selected and finalized, an evidence review was conducted alongside a gap map to assess the quantity of evidence available and the extent to which available research is currently organized in an accessible manner. An implementation plan was developed, and efforts to begin implementation are just now getting underway. So to develop the questions, a number of different stakeholder groups were involved and consulted, and this slide captures that involvement with the inner circles of the graphic representing those that did the work and advised closely, and the outer circles showing those that provided feedback at key junctures. All told, over 200 individuals and over 50 institutions and operating units had input into defining the questions. So this table captures all 10 questions and 5 themes. So of the 5 themes, the first is management and financing of systems and institutions. And under that theme, we had 2 questions around strategy and sustainable financing. Under the theme of academic programs, we had 3 questions around distance education, skills for employability and learning. Under the theme of research and innovation, we had a question around innovation ecosystems. Under the theme of higher education institution outreach and engagement, we had questions around private sector collaborations, higher education institution expertise. And then finally, under the final and 5th theme, access, equity, and student services, we had questions around underrepresented groups and gender. So to understand the current state of evidence around each of these 10 questions, we conducted an evidence review, an evidence gap map, in which we collected and analyzed over 200 published studies. As part of that review, each of the 10 learning questions was assigned to a different category based on the volume of evidence, which was measured by the number of identified studies, the maturity of the evidence, and the number of systematic or narrative reviews. The 3 categories were defined as evidence generation, meaning relatively little evidence is available and therefore needs to be generated. And the questions that fell into that category were around finance, innovation ecosystems, and expertise. The second category was around evidence capture, meaning that evidence is available, but there are a few systematic or narrative literature reviews to organize it. So there is synthesis and distillation needed. And in that category, we had 3 questions around learning, underrepresented groups, and gender. And then the final category was dissemination, meaning evidence is relatively abundant. There are multiple literature reviews, and we just need to disseminate that evidence to users. And the questions that fell into that category were around strategy, private sector collaborations, distance education, and skills for employability. So our plan for implementation includes 3 objectives over 2 overlapping phases. During our first phase, phase 1, the USAID Center for Education and USAID Washington have 2 objectives. Our first objective is to build awareness of the higher education learning agenda by promoting it through forums like this presentation, so that we can begin to work on objective 2, advancing learning by working internally and with partners to design activities that generate and synthesize learning. So within the next year, we anticipate moving to phase 2, in which we will continue evidence generation and synthesis alongside additional efforts to promote what we're learning through evidence dissemination and use. And these phases aren't linear, but circular, as future years of implementation may necessitate additional awareness building. So our resources, of course, are limited. And while it's not possible for us to directly engage with all stakeholders across the ecosystem, we will directly engage with a subset of actors. And a wider range of evidence stakeholders will be reached through dissemination and use. But we're specifically interested right now in direct engagement, partnerships, and collaborations with 3 main stakeholder groups: USAID missions and OUs, operating units, including those in Washington, implementing partners, and individual researchers and research institutions. So if you fall into one of these stakeholder groups and are doing work in or interested in any of the higher education learning agenda themes or questions, we're interested in talking to you. So what are potential ways to collaborate? Given the forum for this presentation, we'll focus on collaborations with external stakeholders. So if you're an implementing partner, you can submit concept notes, applications, and proposals that incorporate the learning questions. If you're an individual researcher or part of a research institution, you can align research interests and work with us to complete research projects of joint interest. And whoever you are, you can inform us of knowledge and research related to learning agenda themes. We will keep our website up to date at education links. So please do check our site regularly. You can keep up to date on learning and anticipated requests and calls for information and research by checking the site. We're also standing up several communities of practice that will provide opportunities for networking and collaboration over the next year. Our higher education engagement and transformation community of practice under Youth Power launched in March of 2021 with a focus on advancing higher education and positive youth development and learning opportunities around those themes. We invite you to join our community meetings. And to do that, you can visit youthpower.org and click on communities to learn more. We also anticipate launching a new higher education network to join the Education in Crisis and Conflict and the Global Reading Networks through the Leading Through Learning Global Platform contract soon. So we welcome your requests and questions and are available for questions, comments, and invitations for collaboration at helearning@usaid.gov. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Ilham Shalabi and I served as the research assistant supporting USAID research project on USAID Higher Education Scholarship for Development. I conducted this project with Dr. Ann Campbell, who consulted as the senior researcher. This project was done as a consultancy work through Dex's consulting firm. I'll be sharing results from our work and highlighting knowledge product that would inform and guide USAID staff and higher education specialists in higher education scholarship programming. It's very important to mention that USAID efforts in higher education scholarship programming is intended for development, unlike those of the Department of State that are intended for the public diplomacy. Therefore, the overall goal of this project is to enhance and support USAID development agenda and improve USAID higher education scholarship programming practices and policies. There are four main aims. This project aims at identifying good practices, challenges, and opportunities within USAID higher education scholarship and sharing them across mission. It also helps at advocating to adopt evidence-based approach to programming higher education scholarship. It also supports USAID scholars learning and university experience. The result of this research project is to create 12 knowledge projects that would support USAID work in higher education scholarship programming. The research methodology that we followed is qualitative-based research. We conducted 17 interviews in 12 different countries. We also made sure to follow up with the interviewees to acquire more information and details. We also performed document review on USAID evaluation reports on higher education scholarship that they implement, as well as other international scholarship programs. The scholarship program that we focus on are both embedded and standalone programs. Through our research, we aim to answer these questions. First of all, what are the main challenges to designing, implementing, and managing successful USAID scholarship programming? Second, what are existing promising approaches used in scholarship program design, implementation, and management? Third, what additional information do USAID staff and implementing partners need to design, implement, and manage scholarship programming effectively? 4, what is the most convenient presentation or type of knowledge products for USAID staff and implementing partners to use? And fifth and last, what are the focal areas, trends, populations, questions which need further consideration or investigation for the next stage of USAID scholarship programming? The result of this research project were translated into knowledge products. Knowledge products are a type of documentation that USAID used to present and share information. We created 12 knowledge products in the form of a toolkit. This toolkit focused on important themes in international higher education, like monitoring and evaluation, diversity and inclusion in higher education, as well as alumni engagement. Each knowledge product has a specific focus, but they all complement each other and support each other. I'll be presenting to you 3 main knowledge products that are highlighted in bold. The first knowledge product that I'm going to present to you is 7 important questions to ask while designing USAID scholarship activity. This knowledge product is in the form of a checklist of 7 questions and sub-questions followed with a prompt that provide additional information. The aim of this knowledge product is to guide USAID thinking while designing USAID higher education scholarship at the first stage, and whether this scholarship meet with USAID development goals. It also helps avoid common errors and pitfalls in activity design, like focusing on degrees area that are not important for the economic development of that country. And also it helps to account for possible risks like natural disasters and conflicts and pandemics. The second knowledge product I'm going to present to you is scholarships embedded in larger USAID activity. It is in a form of good practice brief. It focuses on embedded scholarships. Embedded scholarships are a type of scholarship that are part of a larger intervention. Usually USAID design this type of scholarships in agriculture and public health sector. This good practice brief focus on how USAID staff think strategically of how USAID scholarship fit with a larger intervention. It also helps improve the quality and the impact of the scholarship activity. The third knowledge product I'm going to present to you is scholarship alumni engagement. It is also a good practice brief that focuses on the idea that alumni engagement should start from the onset, not only after the students or the graduate student graduate. It provides information on USAID Alumni Association like Alpha 1, it is Indonesian Alumni Association, and as well as other activities that help engage the alumni to support USAID and development agenda. These knowledge products will be published by the summer, and you can find them on education links. I would like to take time to thank USAID higher education specialists and interns who contributed to our research and provided feedback. Thank you so much for your listening.